Welcome to the Sanity podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, along with my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, we speak to the people that you want to hear from.
We're joined this week by Benjamin Anthony. Benjamin's the co-founder and CEO of the Miriam Institute, a forum for expert analysis on Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and the alliance between the two countries' militaries. He's a combat veteran of the IDF, participated in multiple wars and operations, including the Second Lebanon War in 2006 and Operation Swords of Iron in 2023. Benjamin's a regular commentator on international media. He's advised U.S. officials on Israel and Israeli National Police and the IDF on communications with the English-speaking world, which is probably arguably the most difficult job you've ever had. He's a graduate of the University of Manchester and Cambridge University in his native England, and he now lives in Israel and has for some time. So we're really happy to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
I wanted to start, Benjamin, with just the news over the last few weeks. Over here in the United States has been all the meetings about the end of the war, and I put that in air quotes. But, you know, President Trump and Tony Blair and Jared Kushner had a meeting, Secretary Rubio had a meeting with Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar. We had Ron Dermer over here, I think, the week before last. So there have been a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions about what the end of the war in Gaza would look like and what would happen afterwards. And at the same time, we have the Trump administration, I think, still very much backing Israel's push into Gaza City. So it's unclear what the end of the war would look like, if we're headed in that direction, or, you know, just where we are generally. So I wonder if you just speak to what's the takeaway from all of these meetings from your perspective, and what does an end of this war even mean?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much again for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and I wish you every continuing success with the podcast. So what's going on at the moment? I'll tell you the stuff that's available in the public eye, and then I'll opine on it if that's acceptable to you. And just feel free to interrupt me or adjust the direction of my comments at any stage. So we know that there was a meeting at the White House that Steve Witkoff expressed was going to be an assessment of a long-term, all-encompassing fix and all-encompassing vision for the next stage of the Gaza Strip in a post-war reality. We also know that that was attended by two very interesting figures, Jared Kushner, son-in-law of the president and former senior White House advisor during the first Trump term, and of course, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of once Great Britain, the country in which I was born, raised, and educated to the extent that I am educated. In addition to those two individuals being present, adjacent to the meeting, we learned that Prime Minister Netanyahu's senior most advisor and confidant, Ron Dermer, was on the ground. And that speaks to perhaps the degree of coordination. It could also speak to a degree of concern that Israel has at this time when it comes to looking at what this White House may wish to promote and put forward as the day after inside the Gaza Strip. Now, I'll tell you why that is. There seems to be some chatter in the background about the notion that the Palestinian Authority must be put in place to govern the Gaza Strip in a post-Hamas reality, in an end-of-war reality. Now, that's something to which I am completely opposed. I don't think the Palestinian Authority is any less jihadist, genocidal in its viewpoints with regard to the state of Israel than is Hamas. I'll remind people that the Palestinian Authority was in the process of blowing up and murdering innocent Israelis in the course of undertaking the perfectly ordinary by way of a massive, unrelenting homicide bombing campaign until our erstwhile Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided to establish a security barrier that physically prevented the Palestinian Authority and Fatah from carrying out those horrific crimes. It was only once they were barricaded out of the state of Israel that the Palestinian Authority and people under their charge stopped murdering Israelis inside the state of Israel. So the notion that that authority should be handed the keys to the Gaza Strip, to me, is completely absurd. And I think Minister Dermer is probably on the ground in part to make sure that such an idea is not promoted by the Trump administration. So that's number one. That's the first point. The second point that I'd like to make is that Jared Kushner has variously opined on different resolutions to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, including when he was senior advisor to the Trump administration. He's someone that I judge to be a great friend and supporter of the state of Israel, but his opinions have fluctuated, in my view, from being very, very bright and astute to far less so. I'll give you a couple of examples. After October the 7th, Jared Kushner sat for an interview. I think it was at Harvard University, but I'd have to check that. And in that conversation, he expressed that with a more muscular diplomatic approach on the part of the then Biden administration, the Egyptians might be compelled to absorbing the displaced Gazans from inside the Strip. Eminently sensible idea. I would like to see the relocation of the Gazan population from inside Gaza in its entirety. I'd be happy to talk about why I believe that that's the only practicable policy that we should be chasing and pursuing. But then Jared Kushner followed up that wonderful idea with the notion that perhaps in the interim, until Egypt could be convinced, Israel might like to absorb the Gazans into Israel's sovereign territory. So essentially outlining a plan whereby Israel would import Hamas into its own borders. So that's an example of the seesawing of wisdom that I've seen from Jared Kushner on this issue. The other thing I want to mention about Jared Kushner and Tony Blair is that, contrary to the perception of most, both of these individuals have been vociferous advocates of what I call the two-state delusion, the nonsensical idea that we should establish a state for the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria, some call it the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, with contiguity between the two that would bifurcate north from South Israel, and that would also see the establishment of the capital of this putative Palestinian Arab state being none other than the eastern section of Jerusalem. Now, that's not understood by too many with regard to Kushner. It is understood with regard to Tony Blair. So I just want to draw everybody's attention to a document that was released under the auspices of Jared Kushner that was called Peace to Prosperity. Some of you may remember, your viewers may remember, this idea that Donald Trump, during the first Trump term, was going to unveil the deal of the century. That was what it was commonly known as. It didn't come to light, but Jared Kushner, who was in charge of packaging together that deal, called it Peace to Prosperity. And in that deal, Jared Kushner called for, contrary to what most people believe, after several conditions of behavior would be met, presumably by the Palestinian Arabs, he called for the establishment of a state for the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria, the partitioning of Jerusalem for the purpose of giving the Palestinians a capital, that capital in writing to be called Al-Quds, according to the document, the establishment of a second enclave of the same Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip, contiguity along the lines that I just described a moment ago, and then the ceding of further Israeli territory in the Padran Desert in southern Israel. So that, to my mind, masquerades as being a very pro-Israel policy. It was accepted by many policy analysts as being pro-Israel. But if one actually opens the document, gets into the detail, one will see that it was a very dangerous policy indeed. Now, all of that is to say, Jared Kushner, Tony Blair, two very interesting individuals present at the table. Having them there is in keeping with Jared Kushner's policy, namely consulting with movers and shakers from the past in order to resolve problems of the present. I think that's a very positive way of looking at things. But I don't know if they have moved away completely, totally and utterly from the notion that a state for the Palestinian Arabs should be established in Judea, Samaria, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. What I personally would like to see is I would like to see the world recognize, starting with the White House, that when a people vote for an administration, a government, a regime such as Hamas, that as part of its election campaign calls for the complete destruction of the Jewish people and the Jewish state, and then that people witness the attempt to destroy the Jewish state and the murder of 1,200 of our people and the kidnapping of 252 of the people, I would like to see the international community understand that any people responsible for propping up a regime such as that, and then celebrating, as we saw the Gazans, not Hamas, the Gazans do, on October 7th, as our soldiers were dragged through the streets of Gaza with their entrails hanging out, as Holocaust survivors were taken captive as infants, like the two Bibas children, Ariel and Kfir, were taken into captivity. Any people such as that is completely, totally, and utterly disqualified from any notion of statehood in perpetuity. In perpetuity, they are not fit to have a state. And what I would like to see championed by the state of Israel is the permanent relocation of the Gazans out of the Gaza Strip. I would like to see pressure brought to bear, just a scintilla of the pressure that's applied to Israel, brought to bear against the Egyptians, against al-Sisi, compelling him to absorb the Gazans into the Sinai Peninsula. And I'll tell you what would happen were that to come about. Number one, Sisi would probably either shoot at the Gazans, very unlikely that would be the case, or much more likely, he would simply move them on into the continent of Africa, throughout which they would be dispersed, and we would avoid them from ever propping themselves up into the terror state that the Gaza Strip was until we launched our counteroffensive in the wake of October the 7th. So I hope I'm giving you some food for thought and getting my points across. And I'd be happy to bear out anything that I said in greater detail if of interest to you.
Thanks for that kind of expansive political panorama. Let me ask you about, in a sort of more localized sense, about the military campaign right now against Hamas, and how do you assess it? How's it going? You know, one criticism we often hear Israel is, well, what are the military objectives now? What is there yet to be achieved? So, you know, any political solution is going to be downstream from military reality. So, where do you think things stand?
So I think that militarily, to our credit, every military clash that we've had with Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, we have emerged from victorious. There is nowhere within Gaza where there has been a kinetic clash, as I said, between the members of the Israel Defense Forces and the members of the Hamas terror army, where they have either managed to stand fast or to repel the Israel Defense Forces or to defeat the Israel Defense Forces. So in that sense, we've been very, very successful. We smashed at least 22 of the 24 Hamas battalions that existed prior to October the 7th. They are replenishing their numbers, incidentally. They're doing that because the Gazans themselves represent a ready recruiting ground for Hamas. That's another reason why people need to recognize that as long as the Gazan population remains on the borders with the state of Israel, the state of Israel will not know peace, and it certainly will not know security, and it will not perceive its future as being safe. So militarily, we have overcome whatever it is that the Hamas terror army has tried to put in our way. I'm a bit concerned, however, about the fact that it's now morphing into something of a guerrilla fighting campaign, a guerrilla military, a guerrilla force, rather, against a standing military. That always spells challenge, great challenge, even grave challenge, for even the best of the militaries around the world, the IDF being one of those, quite definitely. The longer that we stay present, the more opportunity there is for Hamas to learn about our strategies and our tactics. Remember that militaries should really be doing one of two things. They should either be moving forward, advancing, or they should be moving backward. Not necessarily retreating, that as well, but certainly they should be on the move. What they should not be is static. They should not be static, because being static gives the enemy the opportunity to learn what you're doing, to learn where the gaps are in your defense, and then to exploit those gaps. We saw just last week, for example, that there was a raid on one of the bases that the IDF has propped up inside the Gaza Strip. It was repelled successfully, but the goal of that raid was actually to kidnap soldiers of the IDF. So I think the quicker we can bring this war to an end, the better.
Does that mean you're against a military occupation or a permanent military presence in Gaza? What does that mean kind of practically?
Yeah, I'm definitely against a military occupation inside the Gaza Strip, because I think that it's unnecessary, first and foremost. I've said what I would like to see come about quite frankly, in the very, very near term. Perhaps I'll take a moment to speak about it in due course. I do not think, that as a result of Hamas murdering 1,200 of our people, kidnapping 252, and still holding 20 alive and 50 who are no longer of this earth as hostages inside the tunnels of Gaza, I do not think that that obligates Israel to somehow handle every aspect of day-to-day life inside Gaza. I think what that obligates Israel to do is what the two war aims are. Number one, destroy Hamas as a terror army that can threaten Israel ever again in the future, destroy those capabilities. And number two, and this isn't necessarily in order of priorities, incidentally, to bring back and to recover and to retrieve all of our hostages, those who are alive and those who are no longer alive. After those aims have been achieved, we should not be sending our sons, our daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters to govern a people inside Gaza who do not want to be governed by us. They simply do not want to be governed by us. In fact, the vast majority of them do not want us to exist. We also lack the manpower. This is part of a very central debate within Israel as to whether or not we're going to draft the ultra-Orthodox in order to stem and end the shortfall in manpower that we have in the IDF, this being our longest war since the inception of the State of Israel. None of that should happen. What should happen is the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, rather than outsourcing the responsibility for presenting a vision for the day after, should, in my opinion, have embraced with far greater intensity than has been the case to this point, the vision put forward by Donald Trump, namely the relocation of the Gazans out of the Gaza Strip. And we should declare that that is the outcome toward which we are fighting. The Egyptians bear massive responsibility for what happened on October 7th, massive responsibility for what happened. They're eminently well-resourced to absorb the Gazans, and the quicker that we can end the war militarily and give the responsibility for the Gazans to the people who say that they are so very concerned about them, namely the Egyptians, the better. But it shouldn't fall to the purview and to the responsibility of the soldiers of the IDF.
And Benjamin, I've written a column about this, about Egypt and its responsibilities, but it has to date refused to accept any of them. If they continue to just say no to what you just suggested, what then?
Yeah, so first of all, please, after this conversation, send me your column. I'd love to see what you wrote there. And I also thank you for drawing attention to that. Was that essentially the emphasis of it, that the Egyptians... Tell me about it for a moment. Sorry to turn the tables, but what was the crux of your column?
I wasn't making a policy recommendation so much as pointing out that they had a border with Gaza. It had to do with this debate that's been happening here about aid to Gazans, and that the international community has ignored any responsibility that the Egyptians have towards the Palestinian people. Not even going so far as you are as to say that they should take them in. Just how about like letting aid go through their border?
Yeah. Or when Israel gets, even before the war, gets lashed for a blockade or a siege or all this. I mean, people forget that, Egypt controls obviously.
So that I think has not been talked about much in the media, but it is clear, right, by the size and of the wall that they've built, to keep Palestinians out, by the armed, military that they have on their border. They're not letting Palestinians in. They don't intend to, at least at the moment. So unless you have intel on the inside that tells us that there are conversations there, I'm wondering if they continue to just refuse to take in Palestinians, what then would you suggest? What should Israel do?
Yeah, so first of all, what a sad indictment on the consumer of news that it needs to be pointed out to them. But I know it does by individuals such as yourself, Rebecca, that Egypt actually shares a border with Gaza, and Egypt is really in revolt against its own responsibilities here. I think there are a couple of points. Firstly, as the fighting intensifies inside Gaza City, if we are successful in moving the Gazans down south and moving them ever closer toward the Egyptian border, I think that there's actually an opportunity to intensify again the pressure on the Egyptians to absorb the displaced Gazans. That's number one. The move to have the Gazans move from Gaza City southward, that is underway at this stage. Now, it's not actually happening at the pace that the IDF would like to see, in part because of Hamas. There are a couple of other considerations. But I believe that would ratchet up pressure if it was accompanied by pressure overtly being applied by the Americans to the Egyptians. The second thing is that I actually, and I know this is controversial, but I view the threat of the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza as so existential to the future of the state of Israel, so existential, so dangerous, that I would even run the risk of fracturing, downgrading, injuring the peace accords that we currently have with the Egyptians in order to facilitate the egress of the Gazans out of the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Peninsula. I don't believe that the Egyptians would wage war against the state of Israel were that to occur. I don't believe that the peace agreements were robust enough to prevent what happened on October 7th. Remember, Hamas got so much of its know-how by crossing from the Philadelphia corridor into the peninsula in Sinai, up over to Lebanon, into Syria, over across Iraq, and into Iran, and then retracing their steps under the gaze of the Egyptian security forces, and then launching these horrors upon us. So I think Egypt should have to pay a price. And I think that there are really just two questions that need to be asked of the Egyptians. They should be asked in international forum. They should be asked by the Americans, incidentally. Number one, if you so greatly care for the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, why do you have your guns pointed towards the area where they may come towards you from in search of succor and basic humanitarian needs and reestablishing their homes? That's number one. And the second question that should be asked is this. If, as the Egyptians ridiculously state, and by the way, many members of the international community do the same, if it is the case that the Gazans uniquely, in terms of being a displaced population, displaced incidentally as a consequence of the actions of their own leadership, if they uniquely wish to stay exactly where they are, they uniquely want to stay in the immiserated conditions in which they find themselves, again, because of the actions of Hamas, open up your border. What do you have to fear? The Gazans must be so attached to their land inside the Gaza Strip that nobody would walk into the Sinai Peninsula, even if given an open door opportunity to do so. I mean, these two questions should be posed, and I think that we know what the answer is. The answer is that the Egyptians don't care about the Gazans, and the answer is that if given the opportunity, the vast majority of Gazans, as they will tell you if you ask them, would leave the Gaza Strip. And I'll tell you one other thing. I served inside the Gaza Strip. My service there was rather unique in terms of my own military service past. I was part of the rapid response unit for the lieutenant colonel responsible for a segment of the Netzarim corridor. And the Netzarim corridor runs east to west, right across the Gaza Strip. I traversed the Gaza Strip dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times during daylight hours and very much during nighttime hours. And I want people to know that the Gaza Strip is destroyed. It is destroyed. It has been demolished. It is uninhabitable. The damage inside Gaza is beyond my ability to describe. It's also the case that as extensive as the damage is, it is justified and it was unavoidable simply because of how commonplace and how rampant Hamas's presence was inside the civilian infrastructure of the Gaza Strip itself. So Gaza is uninhabitable. Now, I'm not a fan of the Gazans. I think a lot of people bask in this idea that there's a hard separation between the ideology of Hamas and the ideology of the average Gazan. I'm not one such individual. I've seen how the Gazans chanted and cheered when our hostages were released in emaciated states. Saw how they bayed as crowds and pursued our hostages who were desperate to come home. I've spoken about how they cheered the actions of Hamas on October the 7th. Not Hamas, the Gazans themselves. So I'm not a fan of the Gazans. I think anyone who wants to tell me there's a hard separation of mentality between the Gazans and Hamas has all of their work still in front of them as far as I'm concerned. But if some of your viewers happen to be fans and lovers of the Gazans, if they happen to have found themselves in that completely absurd position, in my opinion, they should not want the Gazans staying inside the Gaza Strip either, because they are condemning the Gazans to living in a set of conditions that they themselves, these viewers of this conflict, would never, ever wish upon their worst enemies. The Gazans need to be given the opportunity to relocate. Incidentally, all of the incentive to relocate has already been undertaken, not deliberately. It's just a result of the war and just how widespread this war is. It's time for us to start moving towards that policy outcome. That's what I hope will come out of the White House. I don't know if it will or it won't, but I would very much like to see my Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, affix that vista as the long-term outcome of the fighting inside Gaza. And I'd like to see him do it rather quickly.
Let me ask you a question, which I think is inevitable, and that is the question of international pressure on Israel. Is that something? Well, one, is that being felt inside Israel? I mean, obviously, us here are very attuned to it. That pressure is, sort of most intense around, has been sort of, it's a moving target, but there is the issue of the famine, issue of the Gaza City invasion, and then this question of relocation. So is your advice kind of...
And the UN in the fall, which is another
right, around Palestinian statehood.
Right.
So is your high-level advice push forward, kind of call the world's bluff? Do you have a different read of Israel's position internationally? What's kind of your theory of the case for why that course should be pursued, despite, what seems to me a pretty significant pushback it would precipitate?
Yeah, so firstly, I completely acknowledge and affirm what you're saying, that it's a very significant degree of pushback that we're absorbing. And I'm not surprised by it at all. Years ago, I would lecture on the university campuses in the United States, and I would urge the pro-Israel elements within the audience to do what the Palestinian Arabs do. The Palestinian Arabs have a very, very streamlined narrative when it comes to their campaign on university campuses. It's what they call for, not their destructive call from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, but what they used to call for, is a resolution to the conflict. They used to say it's about pre-67 borders, the right of return, occupation, and that these sites in the state of Israel are the religious and holy sites of the Muslim faith. That was basically what they used to talk about. The Jewish voices would come out with the most convoluted nonsense, talking about, well, we can swap 97% with mutual land exchanges and we'll give you half. People didn't know what the Jewish population was talking about when it would talk about peace, because it never streamlined the narrative. And when I would suggest other narratives, for example, that the Jewish people adopted the narrative that expressed that this is the land that God swore unto our forefathers, this is the homeland of the Jewish people, sworn unto our forefathers by God. It's from this land that we stem. It's about this land that our future is inextricably tied. Something along those lines. People say, well, no one's going to believe that. And I would respond to those people by saying, can you please direct me to the narrative by way of which the international community does accept our presence in the land and the state and the borders of modern-day Israel? Can anyone direct me to any such narrative? And the answer is, of course, stone silence would befall the entire room. All of that is to say that I think that it's very clear the international community, as though that's a real concept, incidentally. They're all just interest-based entities. But the international community, such as we're calling it, has turned its face against the right of the state of Israel to push on toward victory inside the Gaza Strip. So it already hates us. It already hates the IDF. It's already pursuing our officers, our soldiers, our ministers through the courts. It's already academically boycotting our professors. It's really brought us to being something of a pariah state. My view, and I'm a minority view, would be get something for that. If they already hate you, get your long-term security for that. Fight this enemy until it's complete, total, and utter destruction. Win this war. And I'll add something else to this, and then I want to come back to some of these European leaders. The members of American Jewry and supporters of the American Jewish community, and there are many of them, they're just not as outspoken as the opponents of the state of Israel and as the opponents and the anti-Semites and the Jew haters who have become ever more vocal. Members of the American Jewish community ought to consider the following. Pre-October the 7th, the anti-Semites existed on the university campuses. The anti-Israel professors existed. They didn't suddenly come to life in a post-October 7th reality. They were there latently. And so one has to ask the question, what empowered them to unmask themselves and to reveal the fact that they not only hate the state of Israel, but they hate Jews living in Manhattan? And my answer is this: since the inception of the state of Israel, certainly since the Six-Day War, there has been a begrudging acceptance among the most virulent of Jew haters that there is one aspect to Jewish existence that is invulnerable, and that is called the state of Israel. And on October the 7th, that invulnerable aspect seemed to be desperately, desperately vulnerable and there and ripe for the distraction. And these anti-Semites overseas thus reasoned, if the state of Israel is vulnerable and ready for the taking, perhaps the community of the people of Israel here in the United States are equally vulnerable, are equally embattled, are equally ripe to be run roughshod over. And I say all of that because that is what caused the anti-Semites to come en masse. By the way, the most dangerous aspect of this is not that they've come en masse, it's that to this point they've learned that there is neither punishment nor penalty for demonstrating their Jew hatred in public. What people in the Jewish community should understand, and this comes back to your question, Ari, is that if you want to put that Jew hatred back in its box, you'd better win this war conclusively. You'd better win this war conclusively, and you'd better demonstrate that that which was perceived as invulnerable is indeed here for the long term, namely the state of Israel. If the state of Israel does well, the people of Israel will do well, including in Manhattan. So that's why I believe it's in our eminent virtues, to our eminent virtue, to push on inside Gaza until we topple Hamas and until we bring back all of our hostages. And the final thing that I want to say to you about these European non-leaders, like the Prime Minister of, as I said, no longer Great Britain, Keir Starmer, the country that I was brought up in, the country that granted succor and safety to my grandfather and my grandmother just prior to the events of the Holocaust, when my grandfather saw the writing on the wall. They are running scared of the ever-growing, ever more outspoken, ever more fanatical Islamic population within the borders of Europe. And they wrongly rationalize these non-leaders of these countries, these European countries, that to placate the jihadist Islamic movements within their borders, they should come down very, very hard with their criticism against the state of Israel. What these so-called leaders fail to understand is that the Islamic communities within their borders, the hard line within the Islamic community within their borders, and it's ever growing, they're not for the placating. They are there for the taking over of Western society and culture within these European countries. I saw it growing up there. If you ask them, they will tell you that. And the declarations of people like Keir Starmer and Merz of Germany, and of course, the absolutely imbecilic clown Macron over in France, right? Those declarations are nothing more than the act of a supplicant to a threat that is growing within their borders. And if they had any sense, decency, spine, or gumption, those European leaders, instead of doing what Keir Starmer did in Britain, saying that unless Israel comes to heel and adheres to the conditions that Britain's decided it needs to implement in the course of this war, that Britain will go to the UN General Assembly and declare its recognition of a state for the Palestinian Arabs in September, what he should have done is he should have looked at the fact that our hostages are starving and that this terror army, Hamas, is absolutely implacable. And he should have said and made a declaration that expressed that unless Hamas surrenders and unless Hamas releases all of our hostages back to the state of Israel, those who are alive and those who are no longer alive, he will go to the UN General Assembly in September, and he will, alongside other European non-leaders, express that forevermore the notion of establishing a state for the Palestinian Arabs will be removed permanently from the docket of British foreign policy making. That's the ultimatum that he should have put out there. But of course, he's so wimpish, so chinless, and so weak that he managed to get himself to precisely the opposite outcome that would have been to the benefit of the future of Britain and to the cause of freedom, frankly, everywhere in the world.
Tell us how you really feel.
I'm sorry, but that's I don't feel people are being sufficiently direct about an issue that really does have life-death implications.
I want to ask, Israel's facing a lot of fronts in this sort of larger war. It's not just Gaza, it's southern Lebanon, it's Syria, and of course Iran. Just in the little bit of time we have left, could you give us your view of how much damage did we do to Iran? Did Israel do to Iran, and with America's assistance, of course? And is it sufficient? Is it enough for just a few years? Will it allow Israel the time it needs to deal with the problems in Lebanon? And what does the end of all that look like? Is there an end there in sight?
So here again, I'm a bit of a minority voice on the issue of Iran. I never believed that Iran, sovereign Iran, in and of itself, represented the threat to the state of Israel that Iran would bluster about. When it would say, we're going to wipe you out and we're going to destroy you and we're going to completely end the Zionist entity in the Middle East and all this sort of nonsense, I felt that was good old-fashioned Middle Eastern bluster from sovereign Iran in the absence of them having a nuclear weapons capability. What I felt was much more concerning was the potency and the danger of the Iranian proxies. And I think that my government in Israel, successive Israeli governments, incidentally, not just the one that's currently in situ, made the capital mistake of saying, and your viewers will remember this, we must focus our attention on the threat of Iran. And we can assign our attention to Iran with such great intensity that we can actually just manage the issues that are right on our border. So you saw Israel taking immediate matters of real security and downgrading those matters to management issues, such as Hamas. We saw what they did after being managed for 7 years, such as Hezbollah. I think that was a mistake. I think now that we've taken out Iran's main proxy, Hezbollah in the north, and that we've downgraded their proxy, Hamas, inside the Gaza Strip, what that leaves us to do, Rebecca, is to act when we see the resurgence of the nuclear threat and the ballistic missile threat, to act with greater impunity without the deterrent of thinking, if we hit sovereign Iran, Hezbollah will unleash 120,000 rockets towards our sovereign territory in the state of Israel. So I think Iran is on notice. I don't think that it's been completely wiped out, the nuclear weapons program, but I think it's been dealt a very, very heavy blow. And in the Middle East, turning back a nuclear weapons program by a few years can oftentimes be more than sufficient given the unpredictability of events. We saw that against Iraq, and we saw it with Syria.
The question about the, Hezbollah, have they been sufficiently neutralized to the point where Israelis will live freely in the north again? I mean, what will it take for that area of the country to feel safe and secure?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I can't recall the exact figures, but there's a significant percentage of Israelis who are still unwilling to move back to their homes in northern Israel. And I think that it's because, if you recall, prior to Israel taking the fight to Hezbollah partway during this war, and I incidentally was somebody who was in favor of Israel hitting Hezbollah's capabilities before we launched the ground incursion into the Gaza Strip after October the 7th. I thought we could downgrade their capabilities massively from the air and avoid this exodus of our people from northern Israel into Israel's heartland. But that's not what occurred. What happened is what happened. And I think that prior to us taking the fight to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, it was stated, and then during the fighting, it was reiterated that what we needed was the enforcement of Resolution 1701, which, among other things, called for a buffer zone between, or a DMZ rather, between northern Israel and southern Lebanon. The fight against Hezbollah, unfortunately, did not result in the establishment of any buffer zone. Currently, the ceasefire lines are being enforced by the IDF, which is stationed in, I think, 5 strongholds along the various parts of southern Lebanon. But that's not, in my opinion, a long-term solution. I think what would be a long-term solution would be either the implementation of a buffer zone and the enforcement of that buffer zone, as we were calling for. I don't know why it was abandoned, but I think it was a foolish call to abandon that requirement. The other, which is interesting, it's very different to the dynamic in Gaza, for example, is that Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, is talking about his demand for Hezbollah to completely, totally, and utterly disarm, based on the idea that all of the guns need to be in the hands of LAF, the Lebanese armed forces, alone and exclusively. If that were to happen, if he was given the means of enforcing that, that could bring about a sense of security that's currently absent the picture among too many Israelis who are deciding whether to move northward again and go back to their homes or not.
Benjamin Anthony, thank you so much for joining us. This was really great. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I hope to see you again soon, and good luck with all you're doing.
Thank you.
Bye.